Thanks for being part of the panel. My name is Gaik, and together with Dr. Maysoun Mustafa, we're interviewing Professor David Salt, who is a professor of genome-enabled biology in the School of Biosciences at the University of Nottingham in the UK. So David, as the academic lead for the university's Future Food Beacon of Excellence, which addresses the challenge of feeding a growing population in a changing world, we hope you can answer some questions we have concerning food security in the future. From previous discussions that we had, you were talking about how from food hoarding on a household basis to domestic stockpiling on a national level, COVID-19 has clearly impacted food supply chains. So tell us what you think are some important trends that we need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, good afternoon. And I guess it's a good morning from here in the UK.
Yeah.
A lovely sunny day today, so it's been good. We've had a cold wind from the north. We had a frost last night. It killed my potatoes. Hopefully they'll recover. So we got a local food crisis right there in my back garden. So it's there's always something interesting happen when you work on food, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks for inviting me on to this series. I mean, super interesting time. Obviously, it's a bit scary and interesting as a scientist. I think that the first thing I wanted to do actually is just to stress that a lot of us are talking about COVID-19 and food, but we need to remember that we are in the United Nations Decade of Action on Nutrition. And that's because our food system was already in crisis before the COVID-19 showed up, right? So I think that this is a shock that's happening on a food system which is already in crisis. Right. And I think we're quite familiar with what those crises are, right? We've got a lot of folks in the world that are undernourished, probably about 800 million at least. Yeah. There's then another probably 2 billion that are suffering hidden hunger. Not enough micronutrients in the food, and then frighteningly, a further 2 billion folks who are overweight. So this is an insane kind of imbalanced food system. So I just wanted to kind of stress that, so before COVID-19 showed up, we already have a food system which is definitely under stress. But I think your question is super interesting. What are we going to be looking out for in terms of interesting trends? And obviously there's a ton of stuff we could talk about, and we don't have time to cover it all. But I think there's a few things that I'm quite interested to kind of highlight as we go through. I mean, I've been kind of following the news like lots of people and thinking about all this, and I think one of the things that's come up, which I think in some ways I find quite hopeful within this COVID-19 situation, is there was a recent report commissioned by the Royal Society of Arts, which actually showed that the people at home have actually started to cook more from scratch. So there's about 30 to 40% increase in that, and actually similar increase in a reduction in folks throwing stuff away. So this seems to be a really good trend, that people are actually getting back to cooking more food at home. I think taking more care about the food and actually throwing less food away. So I think that I'm hopeful that will be a kind of a permanent fixture and maybe even increase. And I think in some senses it kind of also couples to what we're seeing around people's interest in locally sourcing fresh foods, an increase in that, and also an increase in people taking an interest again in growing their own food in their gardens, lots of talk about allotments and people back on their allotment and growing stuff. So it's become quite a topic. So I think this is a positive trend. I mean, I think the stress on our food system has maybe highlighted to people that food doesn't just magically show up in the supermarket. That actually it grows and we can cook it ourselves and we can enjoy it as a family. So I think that's a kind of an important trend, and I think we should definitely keep our eyes on that. A couple of other things I'm really quite keen to kind of highlight. One of the things that I think took us all by surprise, though I think it probably shouldn't have, was this whole panic buying situation. I was looking back historically, and there's actually many other examples of this. So when Spanish flu happened in the early 20th century. Actually, there was a panic buying on Vic vapor rub. I don't know if you know what Vic vapor rub is.
Yeah.
But like
like Vicks vapor rub.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there was everyone panic bought this. So you know, I think the concept of panic buying has not been new in response to diseases, right? And I'm sure historians going back to the Black Death and the plague and all this, they understood that, you know, there's all kinds of crazy, interesting examples of people trying to respond in the best way they can. And so I think that this panic buying, you know, we should have expected it, but we didn't. I think what was for me really quite interesting was several different things, but the different things that people chose to buy, and what were the drivers, and can we understand that? I mean, this was, you know, this was quite remarkable. And then, you know, other features that I've also been reading about around the panic buying. So, for example, it seems that panic buying was much more prevalent in large supermarkets rather than small corner stores. You know, what does that tell us about people? I mean, is that people somehow feel in the large supermarket they can behave badly, and somehow in a small supermarket it's much more personable, and you've got the owner there, and it's more community, and so there's a kind of a buffering mechanism there. So I think there's some important aspects there we can learn, and maybe just this impersonal, huge supermarket shopping that we've all think so great maybe there are some underlying problems with that. Maybe it disconnects us from our community, and it maybe disconnects us from behaving responsibly in terms of the way we buy. So I found that really quite interesting. I think, you know, what's happening now, at least from my observations, is that we're seeing a kind of a bit of a kind of a stasis being reached now, where the supermarkets seem to be readjusting a little bit. But I mean, there's still interesting stuff happening. And I think a lot of this is really around the way that our food supply system really kind of got knocked out of kilter by the COVID-19 kind of shock, driven by the panic buying, but not only. So I think, you know, basically what happened is our food supply system really got out of balance. So for example, you know, when all the restaurants are still closed due to social distancing, when all the pubs are closed due to social distancing, and all the kids are, you know, schools are closed, so all the kids are at home. What's that meant is that there's been a real shift in consumption patterns. So whereas, you know, maybe 30 to 40% of people's food consumption pre-COVID-19 was actually achieved through eating outside of the home, suddenly everyone's eating in the home and buying stuff from the supermarket to achieve that, whereas the distributors are set up to deliver a lot of food to restaurants, pubs, etc. And so that was one of the reasons why stuff started you know, you've got the panic buying, and then because the food system is not configured to deliver the goods that are needed in the right place, to change that quickly, then you started to see these crazy empty supermarkets. And even more subtle, like I think the example with the flour in the UK, I think is really an interesting one, because I think it really highlights this, and it seems so simple, but, you know, flour is a good example of this, where, you know, pre-COVID-19, most people bought their bread from the supermarket, and the bread in the supermarket was made by very large bakeries, and very large bakeries require flour in very large bags. And so the millers of the wheat that produce the flour were primarily set up to make flour in 50-kilogram bags, which were then sold to the big bakeries, who then made the bread for the supermarkets. But then what happened after COVID-19, a lot of these big bakeries basically shut down because of the social distancing. Bread disappeared off the supermarket shelves. Everyone switched to making bread at home, but no one wanted to buy a 50-kilogram bag of flour.
Yeah.
Right? And so you end up with no flour in the supermarket, and the warehouses are all full of bags of 50 kilograms of flour that no one will buy. And the reason is that the millers, their production line is set up for 50-kilogram bags, and not 1 kilogram bags for the supermarkets. And the system just can't change quickly, because, you know, you've got all this manufacturing equipment, processing equipment. And so I think for me, what that really kind of highlights, I think, is this problem that, we need to have a much more resilient, adaptable food supply system that we currently have, which is able to adapt to these kinds of food shocks. And I think an important aspect of that I also kind of don't want to forget is that, a lot of this is very, very dependent on the area, the income of the area, the type of the shops in the area. And so I think one of the things that, we need to be paying attention to here is that, particularly, for example, around fresh fruit and veg, a lot of more affluent areas, they have lots of small green grocers. These places weren't suffering, right? Whereas in poorer areas where you've maybe got one supermarket that has no fresh fruit and veg, in these poorer areas, people have limited access to healthy foods anyway, and a much higher prevalence of ill health driven by poor food and poor diet. So, we have to be careful in this situation when you get these, these shocks to the food system. It could just simply amplify the inequalities that we're already seeing before. So I think those are several things that I'm quite interested in kind of tracking. I think in the longer term, so those were kind of short-term issues. I think in terms of the food supply chain. I think in the longer term, there's other big shocks coming that we need to pay attention to, and I think these are a bit more structural. I think these are things around shortage of workers, particularly for harvesting, but also for transport and processing of food. I think that this is going to come up for several reasons. I mean, one, the restrictions on transport, people traveling, it's going to make it very difficult for immigrant workers to come into countries. So, for example, in the UK, a lot of our farm produce is picked by immigrant workers coming in from Europe. So this is a big problem in terms of the fact that, they can't come because of the restrictions on travel, and these restrictions on travel are going to get worse. So as the disease profile progresses and we start to get the cases under control, then definitely we're going to have restrictions at the airports on people coming in, right, bringing COVID in. I think you'll see this in all the countries if they're not already restricting that. So that means people will have to go into quarantine before they can even start working. And then I think particularly for the UK, the whole issue around Brexit just makes this even more tricky, particularly right now where, we're kind of still negotiating what Brexit looks like, and the whole visa issue for workers coming in on a temporary basis to work in farms is not really well resolved. So I think this is going to be, another big problem that we need to face, that we're going to be facing. And then finally, I think on this space of kind of interesting things to look for, I think that, export restrictions could be something that we might be facing too, that as countries, are starting to focus on trying to be more resilient and self-sufficient and not so reliant on external supplies of food, then the knee-jerk reaction may be to restrict exports of food so that at least, we're not giving our food away, at least we're safe. The danger with that is, of course, is that our global food system is completely intertwined. And, sure, most countries probably could be self-sufficient. It'd probably certainly be easier for countries kind of, in the more tropical regions of the world rather than in Northern Europe. But even in Northern Europe, if we wanted to eat potatoes and turnips, year round, then, we probably could survive, right? But, we would have a dramatic change in our lifestyle that I don't think people are, kind of prepared to go in that direction. So yeah, probably a long answer to a short question, but lots of stuff happening. I think that, those are some of the things that I'm quite keen to keep an eye on.
Yeah, so definitely lots to unpack there. But with regards to kind of the supply chain, how can we predict better or kind of design more responsive supply chains moving forward?
Yeah, so that's a fabulous question, and it's something that was actually super interested in. So, and I think this is quite a nice example of how science kind of and research works. So pre-COVID-19, we were very interested and still are interested in this concept of urban food deserts, this idea that when you look across an urban environment, what you see are big inequalities in access to healthy foods, which leads to big inequalities in the prevalence of food-related ill health. And we were developing actually kind of predictive models based on information which would help us understand how these urban food deserts kind of evolved and how we could potentially change them. So if you had a model which said, okay, we put a farmer's market here and a bus stop here, does that help people access healthy foods? When the COVID-19 issue came up, then we started to think, well, we could actually repurpose some of those ideas to start to think about, how do we model food systems such that we could actually start to predict better these potential food shocks and start to understand if we could actually make our food supply systems more resilient. And so we're working with several folks across the university and also in Malaysia on this. And actually one of the team really made a nice point, which I think highlights this concept really well, that, we spend a lot of time and effort building very complex models for our financial systems so that we can do what people like to call stress testing on all our financial systems, which is definitely a very valuable and important thing to do. But we never really think to do the same thing for our food systems, right? Stress testing them. And I think that's what we're really very keen to do, is to develop these kinds of predictive models which would allow us to kind of stress test our food system. And, in a way that, you could then say, okay, well, this is what our food system looks like. And we do this at a level that takes into account kind of regional differences, local differences, etc., and also consumer behaviors, and then ask questions like, okay, well, what happens to our food supply system in this region if this happens? What happens if this happens? And then you've got this predictive model, which would then allow you to actually build a supply system which would be more resilient. And then also with the same kind of model, you can also then develop much more rapid responses, because you've now got a model which says, oh, wow, this is happening on the ground. Or well, because this is happening, we need to try this out. And if we do this, will that help? And you can quickly test that in a model before you actually rush out and start redirecting lorries into different warehouses. And then it finds out, well, that wasn't actually the right thing to do. So this model is, I think the idea is nice, and what we're doing, it has multiple different components. I mean, one is kind of around the kind of consumer behavior piece, which kind of works around what people are eating where based on their demographics and their local regions. Another piece of the model that we're developing is around a kind of much more rapid response drawn from social media feeds to try to understand, what it is people are doing, what are they buying, what are they hoarding, what are they sharing, wasting, and do that in kind of real time so we could feed that into the model. And then the other piece that we're also building in is kind of food diaries. So like trying to get more, kind of app-based food diaries so that people could tell us like what are they eating and why at that time, almost in real time. So that's what we're doing. I mean, it's kind of a really quite a fun thing to do, because it's super interdisciplinary and involves all kinds of different people. So that I guess that's where we're at with that.
I'm just wondering about what's going to happen when the second wave and the third wave hit, because toilet paper, nobody predicted that, right? Toilet paper was something, that someone in Taiwan decided was going to be an alternative to masks. If there was a shortage of masks, that they could use toilet paper. And then who knew it was going to be so big irrationally?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a chaotic. It's like a fractal, right? It's like it's the butterfly effect. Yeah. And these things are almost unpredictable. So I mean, I think behavioral scientists, I mean, it's a really critical role to play, I think, in trying to understand and how you go about limiting this kind of buying, this kind of crazy buying behavior. But like I say, I think there are things in there with this idea that that this panic buying was much reduced in smaller shops. So that tells you something about people. It seems like people, when they're in an environment where they don't feel like, or where they feel it, where they can get away with being irresponsible, they will be irresponsible.
Yeah.
But if they're in an environment where they feel somehow that they need to behave responsibly, then they do. So maybe you could design supermarkets differently to somehow, perhaps to people. I think right now they're quite anonymous, right? You kind of go in and you don't really feel. You're just in a strange space. It's not, and you can just stuff everywhere, and you can just grab it, and it doesn't really matter, right? So I think behavioral scientists have got a huge role to play in as trying to understand this panic buying issue.
I guess it's a little bit like why people go to wet markets sometimes, as opposed to supermarkets or big hypermarkets, because they've also developed some kind of relationship with the small stall owners. When I go back to my hometown, they remember us when we were kids, as when we follow my mom to the market. So it's that kind of relationship where you can't quite develop that with your supermarket or hypermarket counter people, because they always change, right? They're low.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think at some level it's about. I think it's about how people, the level of commitment people are willing to make, right? So I think that. I love going to wet markets too, and if I can, I try to do all my shopping there. But it requires much more input of energy, right? Because you're interacting with people, you're in queues, it's fast moving, there's a lot happening, you're not sure about the price, you're talking to people, and so it requires a massive amount more effort to put in, but then at the same time, you get back so much more, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the supermarkets just remove the need for you to put any effort in.
Yeah.
So, right, but you get nothing back.
So just now in the beginning, you were talking about people kind of returning to growing gardens and cooking more at home. We've also interviewed indigenous people here, and for some who are actually close to the forest or who have a bit of land, they can plant things. But I think the greatest problem would be more for people in the urban areas. So what changes do you expect we will see after COVID-19 across the different population segments, not just in terms of class, I suppose, but maybe rural, urban segments too?
Yeah, I think that this drive to grow more stuff, clearly is not going to have it. The impact it's going to have is not going to be around the amount of food we can actually grow, right? Because it's not going to be enough, right? It's sure if you live in a very rural environment, you can probably be close to self-sufficient, but most folks don't live in those kinds of environments. And so I think the impact's not going to be on oh yeah, we're growing tons of stuff in my back garden, I don't need to go to the supermarket anymore. I think the impact will be much more psychological. I think that it'll help people hopefully reconnect more with their food. Okay. Right, because they may only be growing a basil plant on your balcony, or a miniature tomato plant or a little lemon or something in a pot. But I think what I'm hope it'll do is it'll reconnect people more with their food, and have people start to understand or think through more. What does it mean? Like how I think right now you talk to most people and they're so disconnected to the food. They go in a supermarket, they have no clue. Like they have no understanding of the massive complexity that went into getting that bunch of bananas on the shelf, for example. It's just. I think I call it plant blindness. Other people have call this too, right? People have no. It seems like. They have a vague understanding for meat, but not that great. But for plants, no concept, right? There's that classic picture, right, where it was going around on the internet, which I thought was fabulous. There's a picture of a jungle, right, with just like all kinds of massive biodiversity, and then in the center of the picture is a chicken. And when you ask people what do they see a chicken. That's all they say, right? Because they're blind to the plants, right? They're just blind to the plants, even though there's just thousands of plants in that picture and one chicken. And so I think that kind of amplifies this problem, that when people go into the supermarkets, they're just oblivious to what this means, where this stuff comes from, you know. So then if you start to try to ask questions about, like, well, is it such a good idea to buy an avocado in the winter in like Yorkshire? Then, like, no one even think about that, right? It's like, and then you'd be like, well, they don't grow here. And then people are like, oh, well, I guess so. I never really, right? I did not, but I think so if people start to think more about growing stuff, you know, and I'm seeing that. I mean, I joked about the potatoes getting frosted, right? But I think these are the things that people are now probably discovering, and then starting to realize, well, actually, this is pretty complicated, this whole, you know, food system. So what I guess I'm hopeful that at least that trend will just change people's perspective, and maybe people will be a bit more respectful, you know, around where their food comes from. I think that fundamentally could be a really critical aspect, because then I think people start to think about price. You know, that's another thing I think that's really key here, because, you know, you go in the supermarket right now and no one has any problem in buying a chicken for £2. But, like, how is that possible that you can have a chicken that you can sell to someone for £2 and somehow the farmer can make money? I mean, that can't be the real value of that chicken. It's insane, right? I mean, the problem is that a lot of the cost of that chicken, in terms of the CO2 emissions, the pollution and stuff, is pushed off elsewhere. And it doesn't appear in the price of that chicken that people pay, right? So I think if people are more respectful of the true value of things, then I think that it could also shift things about, well, I'm more prepared to pay more for meat, and I'll only have meat once a week because now I really understand the true cost. So I think that these small shifts in the way people relate to their food could potentially have big impacts down the line. You know, whether it'll happen is another matter. But so I think, yeah, so there's all kinds of interesting stuff, I think, that, you know, in terms of different segments of the population. On a much bigger scale, clearly the you know, COVID is almost certainly likely to cause a recession. I mean, basically we switched off the economy. So the fact that, you know, when we switch it back on again, it doesn't immediately turn back on and we'll be in a recession shouldn't be a surprise. But, you know, unfortunately, that's going to hit the poorest people in the world. I mean, the wealthy people are, you know, be able to weather that, but I think the poorer segments of the population globally are going to be impacted. And, you know, are we just going to see an exacerbation of what we were talking about before in terms of, you know, diseases, food related diseases, non-communicable diseases like diabetes and obesity are already more prevalent in poorer populations. So are we just going to, is COVID just going to make that worse with the recession? People have less money. They're just going to be buying cheaper and more, you know, ill healthy foods. So I think that's definitely something we're going to have to watch. I think, you know, perhaps more slightly away from the issue around food, but I think still really actually quite important, is what's going to happen around work patterns. So I mean, this is already becoming a really hot topic. You know, everyone was told to go home and work from home. Now, you know, clearly, if you're building stuff, you've got to go in the factory, right? So, you know, that's not going to go away, right? But, you know, service economy is a big piece of the economy, bigger in some countries than other, but most countries have a sizable service economy. And those kinds of activities can be done from home. And I think that that's going to be a major trend in the future, because, you know, we're already seeing, you know, I read that, like, Twitter now has said that all its employees can work from home, you know, post-COVID. They just do that because, I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? Because why spend massive amounts of money on very high real estate prices in, you know, big cities around the world, so that you can have a bunch of people sat there working at computers when they could just be sat at home, right? so this is I think this is going to be an inevitable switch. And I think what that's going to do is a bunch of things, but I think one of the things it's going to do, I think, around the food question, is that it's going to mean that people are more focused locally. And if more people are at home, then more people are going to be shopping locally and not grabbing lunch, at the sandwich shop in the big city. They're going to be at home. They're going to be cooking at home. So I think this is, it could have a really positive effect on local communities, which could then again start to drive kind of more local supply systems, and also build more of a local community sense. I mean, I think, we saw a bit of this in Greece, actually. I think it's quite interesting. So, during the kind of financial crisis in Greece, our family live in Greece and lots of friends there. But it was quite interesting because what happened there is a lot of the jobs disappeared in the cities. And a lot of the particularly young Greeks, they moved back to their villages, and they started opening the businesses that their parents used to have, and actually starting to revitalize the local communities. And I think that's, it's a much more resilient system, right? I mean, I think, cities have lots of advantages and definitely not going to go away. But I think that having, local communities that are vibrant is a much more sustainable. Any kind of network is always more resilient, right, than a centralized system. So I think that's an important one. And then I think finally another thing that we need to pay attention to is the governments around the world are investing massively now in kind of trying to keep the economies going on through the COVID crisis, and then once we get out of it, there'll be massive investments. And I think that opens up a huge opportunity to just kind of shift our kind of way of thinking and start to work more sustainably, start to invest in more sustainable technologies, and change the way that we've been, that our economy is working. I mean, I think one example of this, which is quite interesting, is I think kind of neoliberal economics over the last 25 years has kind of convinced everyone that, well, market forces deliver social good, don't worry about it. And then as soon as actually something bad actually happens, big government comes back in and starts massively investing in social services, right? And clearly, the market doesn't deliver the needed social good, right? So I think this is. And then, we even see this in the UK with, a conservative government as having no problem in spending, trillions of pounds on propping up the economy. So I think, with the opportunity to invest in greener technologies, and with the idea that actually government kind of directed spending may not necessarily be all bad, I think there could be an opportunity in the future to kind of start to address, the big questions, which are, much bigger than COVID, right? I mean, and I use it as an example, which I find quite shocking, is that, the death toll in China was appallingly high from COVID, but more people actually, die from respiratory problems caused by pollution. So actually, more people were saved from dying by shutting off the economy in China because of the improvement in the air quality than actually died from COVID, right? And I think those numbers will be the same across the world. So, so these climate questions are much, much bigger than COVID-19, but I think that there's going to be kind of cross-fertilization between the way we respond to COVID and I think opening up an opportunity to do things differently. And it raises questions which again are coming up in the newspapers all the time now. With oil prices dropping off a cliff, what do we do? Do we prop up the oil companies, or do we change, right? And do we switch to sustainable technologies? I mean, and I think it's in the balance, right? I mean, with oil so low, the green, alternative energy supplies are now looking like they're not economic, right? So when you have high oil prices, actually, it's in some senses it's better for green technologies, right? Because it makes them potentially more economic. So that's going to be a challenge. And I think same with the airlines, right? I mean, airlines are pumping out so much greenhouse gas. It's probably the amount of global travel we had in 2019. People are saying that was probably peak airline travel. And are we going to bail those airlines out, or are we going to let them collapse? Because probably it's not a great thing to have so much global travel for all kinds of reasons. So yeah, lots of big things happening.
Yeah, so one thing with, I think, the climate crisis, there is a huge disconnect between time and space. Like something you do today will not necessarily affect your community now. And obviously with COVID-19, it's very different. So people have responded much faster, have engaged with scientific dialogue a lot more, kind of closely listening to advice. So in the context of whether climate crisis or more generally, how do you think this experience, like dealing with this crisis, will impact scientific dialogue, will impact how we address global challenges together as researchers? So how does that fit in here?
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting questions, right? And there's lots of stuff we can talk about there. I mean, one of the things that struck me as being really hopeful. I mean, so I don't use social media, and I don't do any of these things, and I don't know whether it's just because I'm old and grumpy, but I do find them all rather sinister, and I've always found them sinister. I think that being able to look someone in the eye when you're talking to them, and if you can hold a hand or touch them, is an incredibly important system of checks and balances on human behavior. That kind of interaction is absolutely critical for me, the way I think about it. And I think the more that you depersonalize the way people interact, the easier it is for scary stuff to happen. And so for me, I've always been a bit nervous about social media because it's just so anonymous and there's absolutely no checks. I mean, it's a bit back to this idea of the panic buying. It's exactly the same. When you remove the checks and balances off people, which are often physical, then people do crazy stuff, right? In the dark, when no one's watching, people do stuff which is unpleasant. And I think that social media tends to amplify that. And I think that the thing that I was quite excited about was to see that, during the Brexit debate and other, Trump and all kinds of other things that have been happening, people were turning to social media to get their information, which was really quite, nerve-wracking, given how easy it is to manipulate opinion that way. But, from what I've been reading, it seems that, when you're dealing with life and death issues, like COVID-19, more people have been switching back to traditional news sources. So, going back to the New York Times or the Guardian, or really trying to get real information that they can trust. So I'm hopeful that, actually this may, and we're seeing the same thing when people talk about, what the government's response to COVID-19 is. They always wheel out a scientist, right? Like every kind of news event, they've got the chief scientist or the whoever. Right now, I think if you take that and then you look what was happening maybe just 6 months ago in the UK with Brexit, and also with the Trump campaign, which was, we're sick of experts. We don't want to listen to experts. We've heard too much about experts. Right? It's like night and day, right? One minute everyone hates experts, and then now suddenly everyone likes experts, and I think the reason is obvious, right? When it doesn't matter really, then people just get wrapped up in all kinds of silly gossip, and it's kind of fun at some weird level. Whereas I think when you might die, people pretty quickly are like, oh, we probably should, we really have known all along that science is like real, right? And I think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing that switch. So I think that I think that's a good thing. I think in terms of the way that we're doing the science, I think that's also is also really useful. So we've known for a long time the big challenges that society face require transdisciplinary approaches. I do joke a little bit with my colleagues at university is that people like to talk about challenge-based science now, and it's all interdisciplinary, as if it's some kind of super new thing, and I do like to point out that, particularly in the US, but not only, we have college, for example, we have the College of Agriculture, right? Well, if you actually look at the people who are in a College of Agriculture, it's social scientists, it's economists, it's plant scientists, it's animal scientists, because agriculture is a challenge, right? It's not a discipline. So the idea that we have to do interdisciplinary challenge-based science isn't new, but we kind of forgot, right? And so I think that, people need to do the same kind of work for the big challenges we're facing, whether the climate challenge, sustainability challenge. But I think people are really kind of struggling to figure out how you do that work at a university, which is based around disciplines. And I think because those challenges, we know they're there, but they're not quite imminent in some sense, then we're not being pushed as hard as we should be to deal with that, right? Whereas I think with COVID-19, it's happening now, so we got to do something now. And so I think people have I think psychologists will tell you this. People are very good at dealing with tactics, right? That when stuff happens immediately, people are actually quite good at responding, whereas people are pretty crap at responding to a threat in 50 years.
It's sad, right? Because it's a matter of basically people have to die first before, and they have to die immediately, right? It can't be a slow death where you develop cancer and it takes years through pollution and all that. You have to die immediately. You just have to drop dead before the governments actually do anything.
Yeah, and I think it's more, and it's probably not. I mean, in the end, it's people, right? So I think you have to feel like you might die.
Yeah.
Because the government's people, right? Boris got sick, right? And he changed, So I think you have to feel, if you feel threatened as an individual, you will do something, right? And so I think in the research context, what that's meant is that people are starting to think, well, hey, I'm a plant biologist, but how can I get involved in this COVID-19 stuff? Right, and so immediately starting to think, oh well, what does this mean for me? And so people are really starting to work in a much more interdisciplinary way, which is fascinating. And it also, interestingly, the funders have responded very quickly. So UKRI, which is the kind of the large government-based funding organisation for science, for research in the UK, has come out with a call for proposals, which is very non-traditional. So it's like anything related to COVID, and it's not just biomedical, it's all the way across all the disciplines. You submit something and within 10 days, they'll give you an answer. So this is very, very radical kind of thinking, and even more extreme. I've never even heard of this before. What they're saying is, if you have a grant on something, you're allowed to repurpose that grant to focus on COVID.
Wow.
So let's say we have a grant on working on urban food deserts, then we could say, well, actually we're going to switch the focus on that and start to work on the impact of COVID-19 on the food supply system. I think all those things kind of put together, I think science becoming more to the fore again. I think that now people are seeing that this is an interdisciplinary challenge that they've got to figure out how to deal with in a university environment quickly. And the fact that the funders are responding in a way to support that, I think actually, when we come out the other side of this, I think we'll be much more kind of able to do this kind of interdisciplinary working.
Well, thank you so much. I think similar things are also happening in Malaysia. With the government, having calls for doing research on COVID-19, just short-term grants to try and get as much research out as possible. So yes, there is a place for science in today's environment. Thank you so much, David, for your time, and thank you, Maysoun, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yes, so it was an absolute pleasure. I always enjoy talking to you two. And I love my collaborators in Malaysia. And I wish I could do more. But you're a long way away, unfortunately. But at least we can reach out through these kinds of technologies. Not the best way to talk to each other, but it's better than not talking to each other.
But at least, yeah, we are more connected than ever in a way.
Exactly. Exactly. Great. Well, thank you very much.